asked about form. So the question is about Krashen, right? We talked yesterday about Krashen's monitor model, and he had 5 different hypotheses in his monitor model. And so this CLA asks you to talk about 3 different hypotheses. What's a hypothesis? What does that word mean? How would you describe it?
An idea that needs to be tested.
It's a what?
An idea that needs to be tested.
Okay, an idea that needs to be tested, exactly. It hasn't been proven. It's not really a theory yet. Something becomes a theory. A hypothesis is an idea, right? It's what we think will happen. And then we conduct research and we collect data and we see if the data supports our idea or not. The more research we do that supports our idea, the stronger the idea becomes. We gather more and more evidence that says, yes, this is true. When we go out into the real world, this is what we find. This really occurs. We saw that what I said yesterday was that a lot of Krashen's hypotheses, although they're intuitive and they make sense, the data doesn't support them. So this distinction between acquisition and learning, it sounds good, it makes sense logically, but when we go out and try and study the phenomenon, it's not super clear. So, so it's a hypothesis in that it's an idea that still needs to be tested. It's not really solid or firm yet. It's not a theory. So this is his idea. And everybody can have a hypothesis, right? And we need to then conduct research to check it and see if you can gather data that will support it or not. So the first one is, do you agree that because there are many differences between learning in a classroom and acquisition outside the classroom, learners learn in 2 very distinct ways? Well, you answered this yesterday, and you said, yes, absolutely. In my experience, I studied in the classroom, and then I went to the US, and it was completely different than the way I learned in the classroom. So this, again, is subjective, right? In your opinion, do you agree that these 2 types of experiences are totally different? Is learning in a classroom with a textbook, with a lot of structure, somewhat different than learning in an immersion environment where you go out and talk to people and have opportunities to practice and use the language? According to Krashen, what he says is that learning never becomes acquisition. So this is the controversial part of his theory. It's true that learning in a textbook is different than in real life. But what he says is that what we learn in formal learning can never transfer into real life. Now, do you find that to be true? No, right? Not really. We do use what we learn in the classroom. I hope so. If not, what are we doing here? Right? Yeah, that we're wasting everybody's time and money, because if nobody's learning anything, what's the point? Right? So obviously people do utilize what they gain in the classroom. But he says that it's just not the same. And then he also says that what you use in the classroom is part of your monitor. So that's what you use when you're kind of monitoring your speech, right? So you learn something in the class and you think, oh darn, I used the wrong form. It should be irregular verb or something like that, right? So that's our subconscious speaking to us. And so it does work in that way, according to Krashen. So just explore the idea, right? It's not super clear according to Krashen, it's not super clear according to reality, but in your opinion, what do you think? What's the situation between these 2? How are they different? How are they similar?
Dr. Chu, one point you just said that Krashen said that learning and acquisition never be the same. But he didn't say that they contradict each might go together as well.
Okay.
So basically, distance implying that learning is not helping the acquisition.
That's a good point. That's true. Yeah, you are getting that right. Like I just said with the monitor, so the learning does monitor your output, right? So you do use it, of course. So if you're in an acquisition environment, your learning is going to monitor your output. So there is some overlap, right? So this is what you need to explore, okay? And so you only have 4 to 6 pages to answer 3 different hypotheses. So you can only spend 1 page, a page and a half maximum on each of the questions, right? So in 1 page, what are you going to write? 3 or 4 paragraphs. So you write four paragraphs about this hypothesis number 1. What's your experience? What do you think? And try and support it with some information from the textbook. According to Krashen, this is what he says, but in my experience, this is what I've seen, or this is what I've experienced. Okay? So let's look at number 2. Do you agree that if a learner tends to monitor his or her own form, doing so gets in the way of acquiring language? Integrate into your answer the concept of speed. That is, the idea that the monitor cannot be used at all times because of the speed of speech. So I think the question here is about form. What does that mean when you monitor your form? Your grammar, right? The structure of the words that you're using. Did you put the right morpheme? We talked about the morpheme order studies yesterday, right? So did you put, we were talking yesterday before class about the difficulty that students have with the final S morpheme. In plural, we add S to nouns, but on verbs, we add S to singular verbs, right? To third person singular, so they get confused. Well, I thought S was for plural, how is it for singular, right? So they get confused there. So this is monitoring your form. So when a student becomes aware that that's what they're doing, and they think, oh darn, I forgot the S, right, in third person singular, they're using their monitor to take care of their form as they speak. So the other question here is about speed. What's the issue with speed? What is speed used for? We're thinking about output here, right? So how does speed come into the picture?
The monitor influences the acquiring language. The monitor influences the acquiring language.
The monitor certainly can influence acquiring language. How can it influence? We talked yesterday about
Okay, it makes acquiring languages become slow down.
why?
Because when we speak, we have to take care of much of our form, so we cannot speak as fluently as we can.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. So speed is related to fluency, right? The concept of fluency basically has 2 ideas. One is speed, right? That you speak quickly. And the other one is that you have the vocabulary to express your ideas. So when you pause a lot to think about the next word you want to use, and you use a lot of fillers, you say, oh, and yeah, those are fillers, right? We use fillers to occupy space, because when we're speaking, we're taking turns. And so if I stop speaking, usually in social conventions of language, the other person will start. In most cultures, people are a little bit uncomfortable with silence. There are some cultures where people respect silence. In some of the Native American cultures in the United States, it's considered very rude to arrive and just start talking to somebody. You arrive at their house and you sit, and you wait, and you wait, and then finally they'll say something, right? You have to wait for the elder to speak. You can't begin the conversation if you're younger or if you're an outsider. So it's a different social convention in terms of conversation. But in general, in most cultures, and especially today in the modern era, where everything is so fast-paced, right? Everybody's multitasking and doing 100 things at a time, and we're working and doing our masters and taking care of our families and trying to work out and blah, 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 right? Nobody has any time for a pause. So we jump in, right, as soon as somebody stops speaking. So we use fillers to occupy our turn so that the other person won't jump in and take our turn. So we say, and this shows you that I'm thinking, I'm trying to get the idea or the grammar or something to express my idea. I don't want to give up my turn yet. We do that with body language too. If I don't look at you in the eye, I look down, then it's not your turn. If I look in your eye, then I'm signaling to you that it's your turn, you can take your turn. There's other ways. We do that as teachers too, right? When you want to call in different students, you might just look at somebody and wait until they respond, right? And make them really quiet. So fluency has to do with speed. And as you said, the monitor slows down our speed. It has to do with psychology and what we call cognitive overload. So cognition, we talked about yesterday, those are mental facilities, right? Cognition is thinking. And we can only think about so much at one time. You can't do a math problem and try and converse with somebody at the same time, right? It's cognitive overload, it's too much information. And some people who are geniuses, maybe they can, but in general, the general population has difficulty attending to a lot of different information at the same time. So I talked yesterday about that experience when you feel fluent in a language and then suddenly your monitor kicks in and then you lose your fluency, right? So it's this cognitive overload where somebody's monitoring you and it's too much to think about. So you're trying to think of grammar and vocabulary and all of this, so it slows us down. There's one other aspect of the monitor that also slows us down. Can you think what that might be? So one of it is cognitive, and there's another aspect with the monitor that would slow us down. Yeah. Can you explain?
It's like the effective filter policy. So our emotion will affect our the way we use the language. So when we have low anxiety and confidence, we can just be language fluent, but vice versa, we just afraid and
That's exactly it, absolutely. So it's the affective filter hypothesis. When you feel anxiety, that's also going to slow you down. So the monitor is kind of like your mother over your shoulder, right? It's like, no, 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 that's wrong, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. That makes you nervous, right? So you feel apprehensive to speak. Maybe you feel shy to speak in front of a group, or you feel shy to speak to a foreigner or something like that. So your monitor really kicks in, and really you want to do well, you want to speak correctly. So you feel more nervous, you feel more anxious about your production, so it slows you down. So is that clear, number 2? Any other questions about it? Good? All right, so number 3. Do you agree that and also just to point out on here on page 136 in the book, it lists 3 aspects, and it talks about form, speed, and what other one? Meaning, right? Yeah, meaning and use. So we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow when we talk about this chapter. So we'll talk about what does it mean to know a word, right? We talked a little bit about that yesterday. But we said, how many times do you need to see a word to really learn it? When you see it the first time, do you know it? No. Not necessarily, right? Like at least 6. And there are levels of knowing a word. So you need to know the pronunciation. You need to know the collocations, right? Which words it can be used with. You need to know the social context. Is it a polite word or a rude word? Is it an archaic word? Is it really old-fashioned that people don't use nowadays? So there's a lot of levels of meaning, right? Just because you look up a word in the dictionary and you see the first definition, that doesn't mean that you really, really know the meaning of the word. Sometimes there's like 5 or 6 or 7 definitions for one word, right? Like get, for example. My God, you can see 2-3 pages on get, right? So how can we use get in English? It combines with so many things, and it's informal, right? So there's a lot of levels to knowing a word. So Krashen talks about, or not Krashen, but this book talks about 3 or 4 different aspects. And we can talk about more as well. There's the connotation of the word, right? What's connotation? Okay. There's something more to it too. You use it in different contexts because, let's take for example the word skinny. Okay? So you take the word skinny. What does skinny mean? Give me some synonyms. It can mean thin, slim. Can you think of others?
Slender.
What else? Did I spell this right?
Yes.
Okay. What else?
Bony.
Okay. Any others? So these are synonyms, right? What's a synonym? Same meaning, right? More or less. There's some difference here, isn't there? Right? So the difference is in the connotation. The connotation is kind of the feeling. It's a subjective feeling that we get with the word. And because of that, we use it in different contexts, right? So skinny, usually connotation is either positive or negative, right? It has either a good feeling or a bad feeling. Does skinny have a positive or negative connotation?
Negative.
Negative, do you agree? Yeah? Depends a little bit on the context. And it also depends on the culture, right? Because in some cultures, they really admire people who are thin. In some cultures, it's very important to be very heavy because this shows that you have wealth, you have money, you have food, you're not dying from a famine, right? In some cultures, this is like, they don't like thin women. They like women that are really heavy, right? It shows, oh, my man's got money. We've got food, we're doing good. Did you have a question?
Like, I am considered to be kind of big in Vietnamese ladies.
Yeah.
And one of the foreigners looked at me and she has known me for quite a long time and she recognized that I lost some weight and she said, oh, you look skinny. So it is a comment.
Yeah, it was a compliment, right? It was positive.
So it's positive. But skinny means ugly in some culture.
Yeah, so it does depend on the culture, right? So I would say in the United States, skinny is positive. Everybody wants to be thin there, right? There's a saying in English, never too thin, too rich, or too young. So it's very important to be thin there, right? Although most people are not, but that's another point. So, depends on the context, this one. It could go either way, right? Depends on the culture. In my opinion, it's kind of positive, okay? And what about thin? Is that positive or negative? It's positive, right? Because it's the opposite. It's a polite way of saying that you're not fat, right? Yeah, like, oh, she's kind of thin, right? It's very polite. And slim, positive or negative? Positive, right? Same kind of thing, right? And what about slender? Also positive, right? And what about bony? That's negative, right? That's negative. That's too thin, right? You've gone too far on the extreme. And do you know this word? Gaunt. So gaunt means so thin that you kind of look like a skeleton. Like your face is, like really drawn, and maybe kind of gray, like somebody who's been really ill and lost a lot of weight because they've been sick. So they look gaunt, right? Really thin. Yesterday we talked about how many words you should be able to teach or be able to learn in a lesson. And we said how many?
5.
Yeah, around 5 to 7, something like that. But frequently we're required to teach many, many more, right? So this is a strategy that we can use for teaching more than 5 words in a lesson. So this is what we call chunking. So chunking is a strategy where we can teach a group of words. So we learn the whole group instead of individual items. So instead of learning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words, I've learned 1 chunk. So I can learn 6 chunks. So 6 times 6, I've got 36 words, right? So there's some ways around it that we can work around it. So chunking is important. This idea of connotation is also important. It helps us to get a deeper feeling of the word, a deeper meaning of the word. So that also has to do with cognitive overload. Supposedly, our short-term memory can only remember 7 things. Like if you're trying to remember somebody's phone number, right, you need to say it over and over and over because that'll stay in your short-term memory as long as you say it. But if I give you the phone number plus the area code and the country code, and you've got 10 numbers or 11 numbers, forget it, right? We can't remember it. But we try and chunk it. So we'll chunk it into the country code, the area code, and then the phone number. And this is our attempt to try and remember 3 chunks instead of 10 different digits, right? So it has to do with cognitive overload also. It's too much information.
That's Julie.
Yes.
So I got the idea of chunking, but not connotation.
Connotation?
Yeah.
So connotation means the subjective feeling of the word. Does it have a positive feeling or a negative feeling? So the connotation of gaunt is negative. The connotation of bony is negative. Right? They all are synonyms for skinny. They all mean thin or slender, but they have different feelings about them. That's the connotation. So that's a level of knowing a word, right? That's how you have to know how to use it in the right context. Because if your friend had said, oh, you look bony, then it wouldn't have been a compliment, right? And she said, you look skinny, and she was saying it in a nice way. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a problem with us and foreign language learners, right? Yesterday we have some Vietnamese staff chose what like the Autism Day to respect the autistic children, but some foreigners come and say Autism Day sounds negative.
Yeah.
So, and actually change it into Affection Day.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Autism Day to me sounds like we're celebrating autism. Yeah, it's like it's not a good thing, right? It's a problem. Maybe you could say Autism Awareness Day. That would be better, right? So we're trying to raise awareness and consciousness. What is autism? How do we as teachers manage this in the classroom? How do we get them to integrate with their peers? Yeah.
So in the first year we call it Autism Awareness Day. And
No,
then
Autism Day only.
What's
No awareness.
no awareness?
No awareness? To me, with autism awareness, that's fine. It's not negative at all. But Autism Day, because we usually do that for positive things that we want to celebrate, right? You have your birthday, right? Yeah. So, let's see here. So time, focus on form, and knowing the rules. So knowing the rules, there are so many different rules, right? How do you use it in terms of part of speech? Is it a noun or a verb? Is it which social situation can you use it in? What's the connotation? These are all the rules of using the word. And many of these rules are not spoken. It's something you just need to learn by being perceptive. And this is one of the disadvantages that I think that you have in an EFL setting, because you don't usually get exposed to authentic language. And this is where you get the opportunity to get that feeling that this is not appropriate in this situation, because we're restricted to the situation of the classroom. So you don't get exposure to different contexts where you can make these kind of judgments about knowing the rules. Because most people won't tell you, they won't say, oh, that word is not appropriate in this situation. We only use that word in formal situations. Because they don't even know, right? Native speakers just have a feeling. They just know, like they might suddenly feel offended because you said some word, but they don't know. For example, I used to travel a lot to Korea. I used to have a similar master's program in Korea, and I used to go there a lot. And the students, I used to travel with another professor, and she's a little bit older than I am. And the students would always say to her, oh, you look so tired, are you okay? And she would get so angry, because for us in the United States, when you say you look tired, it means you don't look nice, right? You don't look pretty, you look like not so good, right? So she would get really offended. But in Korea, it was a very affectionate way of saying, oh, you know, I hope you're okay, I hope you're feeling well. They were trying to express friendship. They were really trying to be caring and concerned. But she took it as an offense, right? So nobody, and she never told the students that. Well, actually, I think finally she did. She got so upset, she said, you know, in the United States, that's rude. So they could understand, but we try and impose our own cultural rules on the language, right? Like in India, I go there a lot, and in India it's very important to show respect to older people, right? So they don't feel comfortable just calling me by my name. They always have to say Julie ma'am, which we would never say in English, right? You never say Julie ma'am, right? It just doesn't exist. We would say Mrs. Usually we use the title with the last name, right? So you would say Dr. Ciancio. But that's so formal, right? So they just, that's their way of doing it. So in their culture, they could never just call me by my first name. So that's their way of being polite. Although it doesn't translate into English, really, right? We would never use that structure in the US. So number 3. Do you agree that one acquires all forms in a second language in a particular order? So that's what we talked about yesterday with the, what was the theory? The order? The what? Natural hypothesis. Krashen had a method that was called the natural method that was based on the order. And we said we used a different name though. What? You said it. Yes, the morpheme order studies, right? Yesterday we talked about the morpheme order studies. So this is asking, do you agree that one acquires all forms in the second language in a particular order? So do we acquire the forms in the different morphemes in a certain order? Right?
In order to show it yesterday,
yes.
It was not in the book.
That's right. Morpheme?
No?
10.
Okay. All right. But that's what it's referring to. That's what they're talking about. Did they have a different order in the book? Or they just didn't specify, right?
It was not mentioned.
Okay. All right. Well, so what I'm trying to do is give more information, right? I'm trying to clarify. I think that in this book sometimes they don't mention some things that are very important, and they do mention some things that are, in my opinion, not so important. And I have that problem with one of the chapters today. I think they go into a lot of detail that's kind of not necessary. But they forgot to mention one thing that was really important. So we'll talk about that later when I show you the PowerPoint. Like yesterday I said that they don't really talk about interlanguage, right? They use the term, they even use the acronym, they put IL, but they never explain to you what interlanguage is. That to me, that's a big problem. That's a fundamental theory in second language acquisition. That's something you must know when you do an SLA course. So how can they just gloss over it like that? So no textbook is perfect. No textbook is perfect. No person is perfect, right? We produce textbooks, people are not perfect, so obviously the textbook is not going to be perfect, right? I'm sure you found that when you're using a textbook in class. You need to supplement it. You need to add more information or skip some things that you think are boring or irrelevant, right? So I added that to clarify because they didn't specify, right? So this is what they're talking about. Do you agree that we acquire the morphemes in this order? And there was a study, and I'll talk more about it in a minute because I'm going to clarify a few of the slides from yesterday. But do you agree that we acquire in this certain order, right? We said present continuous was first. We saw that the irregular past came before the regular past, right? And we saw, right? We saw that order. So do you agree that people acquire in that order? So once again, this is subjective. This is your opinion. But as a master's level student, you should substantiate your opinion with theory, right? So this is what I think. Based on my experience, this is what I've seen. However, the authors say blah, blah, blah. And as we talked about this morning, the authors have a hypothesis. They're gathering data, they've conducted studies that either confirm or deny their hypothesis. Their hypothesis is not proven, it's not the God-given truth. So this is where our critical thinking comes in. This is where I want you to position yourself as an authority. And you say, okay, this famous guy published a paper and he said blah, blah, blah. However, in my experience, I disagree because what I see is blah, blah, blah. Okay? So this is critical thinking, right? You can disagree with these guys. They're not gods. They did some research, they published some papers. They're a little bit more advanced, they have some more experience. But we have a different experience, right? Everybody's experience is valid. And so we can propose our own opinion. But you should substantiate it. Why? Why do you think that? Okay, that's what makes it academic. That's the difference between just spouting off your opinion or substantiating your opinion with what you've read, with some evidence. Okay? Discuss this in terms of the 3 conditions of time, focus on form, and knowing the rules. So back on that page, okay? Any other questions?
I'm confused with the first sentence. Do you agree with the one on form? What do you mean by that?
The forms are the morphemes. So do you agree that people acquire the morphemes in a specific order?
What do you mean by regardless of
No matter, so input is what you hear or read, right? So no matter what you read, no matter what you're exposed to, let's say you're learning English as an EFL student, so you receive your input in classes, or you're a child born in the United States and you receive your input from your environment, your input is going to be very different. Your input from the classes is very structured, and we teach specific verb tenses, right? First we teach simple present, then we teach present progressive, or whatever order we choose. In a natural environment, you're just exposed to everything. When you're exposed to everything, do you still acquire in a specific order? That's what the research showed, right? I showed you that study yesterday, and they said that children that were exposed in a natural environment, they acquired language. Their L1 was the morpheme order studies, right? In their L1, they acquired in this specific order. So do you agree that that's true? I said that there were some problems with that theory yesterday. They did it with a very small group, right? So if you study 3 children, is that sufficient to say that everybody acquires in that order? So once again, let's be critical. Where did they do the study? Who was involved in it? How many people, right? Let's analyze it. Can we draw that conclusion from this research? So you might need to do a little more research. You might need to look into it. Pull up that original study. Try and find the article. Try and read about it a little bit. Read what some other people say. Maybe you can find some other criticisms. So you can say, according to so-and-so, a different author, he disagrees with the morpheme order studies because he did another study and he found that students or children learned in a different sequence. Depends on their native language. Depends on whatever, right? There might be many different factors. So that's what it means regardless of the input. So despite however you receive your input, do you still acquire in that order?
How do we integrate preconditions in our opinion?
What?
How can we integrate preconditions in our opinion?
Second
Preconditions
sentence.
of time.
Yeah, so can I go into more detail on this tomorrow? Because tomorrow we'll talk about chapter 8. So tomorrow we'll talk about those preconditions. So we'll revisit this idea and try and get more clarification on it. Okay? Because tomorrow is supposed to be dedicated to this chapter, so I don't want to get too far ahead. Because I need to clarify something from yesterday, and I still have 2 chapters to cover today. Okay? So hold that question, remember it, and ask me again tomorrow. Okay? So we'll talk about this. So it's nice, you have an evening to kind of think about it, see if it settles in your mind. Maybe some new questions will arise, and we can discuss it more tomorrow. So let's look at, so first of all, for chapter 5, I wanted to clarify something. So there again, this was the morpheme order studies, right? So yesterday I told you it was Brown in 1973, right? However, there's another pair of people that also published in 1974. So actually, Dulé and Burt are more well-known for morpheme order studies than Brown. So Brown published first, and then Dulé and Burt published after, and they kind of carried this research forward. So I told you I think it's important as a master's level student to be able to cite the major theorists. You need to know Chomsky, you need to know Vygotsky, you need to know Krashen, you need to know these certain people, right? It's like, if you don't know them, you haven't really done a good master's. You need to have this theory. So you need to know Dulé and Burt, they're important. Brown is also important, but he's more well known for other things. He wrote several textbooks that are very, very nice. In fact, we used one of them in the methods course.
What is the method?
Methods, it's methods of teaching.
Oh, method.
Yeah, So you haven't taken that course yet, right? The methods course? So we use a textbook by Brown, and I think it's, I don't remember offhand which textbook it is, but he wrote 2 that are very famous, or 3. And one of them is called Principles and Practice. Yeah, so different methods of teaching English. Yesterday I talked about the audiolingual method, right? Are you familiar with that?
The 12 principles of
The first course, so you did it. Yeah, okay, so you know Brown, right? Brown wrote that textbook, the book that you use.
Sorry, I cannot recognize the word method.
Oh,
So
sorry.
I say it's something new.
My pronunciation.
Oh, no. More listening.
Okay, so you know Brown. Brown is very, very famous. He's another guy that you need to know. So he's not so famous for morpheme order studies. He's more well known for those textbooks that he wrote. Okay? So I wanted to point that out. And also, so let's talk a little bit more about Dulé and Burt. So what they talk about, so in their idea, they were proposing, I told you that they studied native speaker children acquiring English, and they found those morpheme orders. So their theory is that L1 equals L2. This is called the L1 equals L2 hypothesis. So what they're saying is that native speaker children of English learn English in this specific order. Therefore, people who are learning English as an L2 should also acquire these morphemes in this order. They're trying to make a connection. We talked yesterday about the difference between behaviorism and cognitivism, right? We said behaviorism is really just stimulus response. Skinner said that you can't see inside the brain, so we can't make any hypotheses about anything that we can't observe. We have no idea what's going on inside somebody's head. No idea. All we can see is somebody's behavior. So we can measure that, we can observe that, we can see how their behavior changes. And then Chomsky came along and he said, no way, it's just too simplified. People are too complex, we can't say that. There's a lot going on in the mind. We can't limit it to behavior. People make creative responses, they say things that you never imagine. Children say the cutest, funniest things, right? Where the heck did they get that stuff from? They didn't copy it from us, they never heard it before, right? So there's something going on in their mind. We can't deny that. So that's cognitivism, right? There's something mental going on there. So just because we can't see it doesn't mean that we have to ignore it, right? So in my opinion, what's happening here is that there is a long period of time after behaviorism where all of science is reacting against behaviorism. And they're trying to say, no, it's not like that, it's not like that. There's a mind there, there's something more to it. They got really offended and worried about behaviorism, and they spent the next 20, 30 years trying to show, you guys are wrong, this is the way it is. It caused such a big uproar in the scientific community. They really spent a lot of time trying to show it. No, it's not behaviorism. So this is kind of where it starts. And so what they're saying is that the L1 equals L2 hypothesis, later they changed the name of it and they called it the creative construction hypothesis. And it's also a mentalist approach, which is the same thing as cognitive, right? It means the mind. A mentalist approach is taking the mind into consideration, so you might see this word also. So what they're saying is that children gradually reconstruct rules for speech they hear, guided by language universals, which causes them to formulate hypotheses about the language they are exposed to. So yesterday we talked a little bit about language universals, right? We said that there are, That there are specific things that are that apply to all languages, right? All languages have nouns and verbs. All languages have a concept of time, right? So there are certain universals. And so what they're trying to show is that we as humans are born with some kind of mechanism that makes us ready to be able to acquire speech, right? That language is a unique human capability, and we're born with something in our brain that allows us to do that. And so universal grammar, or language universals, is part of that hardwired system. Chomsky later called it the language acquisition device, right? The LAD. So, universal grammar, somebody asked me yesterday if I could bring a list of all of the different language universals. So I did a little bit of research. I told you I'd bring in a list. I thought that there were like 12 universals. I remembered reading that before. But what I see is that Chomsky had the idea of universal grammar. There was a guy earlier in '63, his name was Joseph Greenberg, and he proposed a list of 30 language universals. So I didn't bring that in because it goes into a lot of detail in terms of syntax and different phonemes, right? So he says that there are always consonants and vowels if the language is spoken. So there are lots and lots, and I think it's too much detail for us to go into right now. It's not that important. What's important is that you understand that this concept exists, that there is this idea of language universals. That Chomsky came up with this idea of mental grammar. So there's some kind of grammar in our mind that we're born with when we have these language universals. We kind of know how words fit in with each other. And so this goes back to this, how children make their own hypotheses, right? So they've got this language universal in their mind, they're exposed to language, and based on what they're exposed to, what they kind of do is experiment in their head, where they come up with different hypotheses about how language works. And eventually it works out, right? They might say some things that are wrong, like we saw that example yesterday, Daddy Green did. Right, so they overgeneralize, they learn the ED morpheme and they apply it to everything, and then they realize that no, it only applies to certain verbs. So this is this process of testing hypotheses that goes on inside the child's mind as they're acquiring language. And as we said, most parents don't correct their children, so it's really going on inside the child's mind, right? They're creating the rules.